So I wasn't raised in a very progressive environment. In fact, my family was largely regressive, pining for some romanticized mystery period called the good old days. And this enigmatic era appears to be back when women could only wear dresses and where they had to stay at home and be dependent housekeepers, a time when all men had short haircuts and only white, straight Christian men had rights. It was a time when life was hard, short, and uncomfortable, and when dames, queers, heretics, and colored folk had to worry about attracting too much attention. It seems to me that that was also the time just before everything started getting cool, fun, and better than ever for everyone. Remember, we're talking about people who were always opposed to progress, who hated diversity, and who would not tolerate anything labeled as alternative. They were much happier when there was only one style of anything for everyone to opt for, and when it came to music, there was only one choice, and of course that's country western. So everyone in my family seemed to side with a particular singer named Merle Haggard. Now, he seems to have made a career out of complaining about how things ain't as good as they used to be. Let me share with you a sample, and this may hurt. I wish a buck was still silver. It was back when the country was strong. Back before Elvis, before the Vietnam War came along. Before the Beatles and yesterday, when a man could still work, still would. The best of the free life behind us now. Are the good times really over for good? Are we rolling downhill like a snowball headed for hell? With no kind of chance for the flag or the Liberty Bell. I wish a Ford and a Chevy would still last 10 years like they should. Before microwave ovens, when a girl could still cook and still would. I'm not going to do this anymore. I don't know about you, but I could only interpret that last line as being a very polite way of saying, honey, get back in the kitchen and make me a sandwich. I'd like to add that I just turned over 100,000 miles in my 10-year-old Chevy and 60,000 miles in my 10-year-old motorcycle, both American-made. Everything still works on both of them, and they're both a damn sight better than anything made before 1953, which appears to be the time that Merle is pining for, back before Elvis, before they made any of the good cars yet. This song, obviously, I have a deep animosity, a deep division between his world philosophy and mine. The first time I heard this song, I thought it was enormously offensive, that all this guy could do was bitch and whine and couldn't appreciate what he had. I've always been told that people tend not to appreciate what they've got until it's gone. And I remember when I heard it as a child, I thought, well, that's stupid. Appreciate what you've got while you got it. And that's been my philosophy forever. Now, this album came out in October of 1981 when, according to Merle, a man couldn't work and wouldn't if he could. And I don't know what man he's talking about. I had 2 jobs then. I walked for miles between them, and I was lazy. That was my 19th birthday. And old Merle might have been hating life at that time. I had a great time. Women were far more interesting than they could be in his day, and street rods all looked like the Road Warrior, which was also made in that year. And the music scene, contrary to Merle, had suddenly turned hairy, scary, and mean. That same year, Ozzy Osbourne released his first solo album, Blizzard of Oz. Black Sabbath did the Mob Rules with new frontman Ronnie James Dio. Motorhead held the ace of spades. Iron Maiden were killers. Judas Priest were screaming for vengeance, and AC/DC was back in black. So there was lots better music out than Merle Haggard at that time. There weren't many atheists back then. Everyone was afraid of Satanists instead. If you played Dungeons and Dragons in 1981. You weren't a nerd. You were a witch. If you rode a custom motorcycle, it wasn't a symbol of wealth. It meant you probably had a criminal history. If you had long hair, it meant you did drugs. And if you listened to the devil's music, you were of the devil. And if you were all of the above and a neo-pagan occultist, like I was at that time, well, then you're obviously satanic. To give you an idea how stupid that time period was, I was always told that if you had an earring in your right ear, if a man has an earring in his right ear, it means he's gay. If a man has an earring in his left ear, it means he's a drug dealer. I happened to know a gay drug dealer. And he didn't have either ear pierced. So since I am neither, I decided I needed to get both. Now, I've got a lot of sad tales about how kids at that time were judged and occasionally diagnosed based largely on whether they listened to heavy metal music, especially if they looked the part. And it wasn't just the fans, it was the bands. Ozzy Osbourne and Judas Priest were both brought into court at that time, charged with inciting suicides with secretly coded messages hidden in their song lyrics. Some of you guys may remember this. Now, all at once, everybody's afraid to write anything because of the way some reactionary twit would misinterpret it by trying to play the record backwards. Such was the religious right at that time. But fortunately, another band called Stormtroopers of Death came out with a song that saved everybody when they said, kill yourself, don't rely on no one else, hang it up and kill yourself, no! Remarkably, no one killed themselves with this record on the turntable. So all those accusations of subtly subliminal suicidal suggestions suddenly stopped. Now, Marilyn Manson comes on the scene. He tried to cash in on all that ridiculous fear of satanic rockers. But by the time he came along, we'd gotten past all that. We'd realized that makeup and a costume doesn't make you a monster. The real monsters don't look like that. And he has to cater to a largely atheist audience now instead of doing, outrageous and abominable things for shows. I find him sitting in front of news reporters giving eloquent interviews because that's what we're after, right? We no longer think that sex, drugs, and rock and roll are the cause of evil. Religion is. We're not afraid of being possessed by demons. We're afraid of the priests. Now, let me illustrate what I mean. Statistically, there's a negative correlation between religiosity and what we typically think of as moral behavior. I'm sure most of you have seen the polls estimating the population of convicted felons as overwhelmingly religious, whereas the number of atheists in the prison population are always much lower than the percentage amongst free-roaming citizens. It is not possible that a significant number of these majorities were secretly atheists until they were arrested and that they only converted to Christianity after indictment, but defenders of the faith have argued that. The factions of dominant religion typically have the highest crime rate with special emphasis on hate crimes, that'll come up later. Religious people are more likely to condone the murder or torture of prisoners, where non-religious people are more likely to consider that morally wrong. But it gets worse. Am I the right one? Okay. The most religious countries also have the highest murder rate, and the same is true of the most religious areas within the United States. The higher the religiosity of a given populace, the higher the murder rate. Secular nations show the opposite tendencies, where the less religious they are, the more peaceful they tend to be. Here in America, I always forget I'm not in America. Evangelical Christians have the highest divorce rate. They also have the highest rates of teen pregnancy, which isn't surprising since they think abstinence only is an appropriate way to deal with sex education. I live in Texas, where the abstinence only program has earned us the status of being the highest rate of repeat teen pregnancies. But it gets even worse. Fundamentalist Christians have a higher rate of abortions, a testament to their hypocrisy. This is what a colossal failure the policies of the religious right have always been. But it gets even worse than that. Child Protective Services and other agencies report a significant majority of child abusers and molesters identified as very religious, and the more religious they are, the worse offenders they are. Yet, religious people still argue that the less religious we are, the less moral we are, and that the more we abandon faith, the more violent we become, with the murder rates going up all the time. But that's not what's happening. And it doesn't take much research to see that. I found this on Wikipedia in a minute. And I couldn't find a larger version of this chart, so let's look at this one, depicting violent crime. And yeah, again, we're seeing the opposite trend to what believers think it should be, and the implication is dramatically against them. Now, you'll see a spike where it's on that 70.0 line for the last time. Where is that? That's 1981. And it suddenly plummets. I don't think Merle Haggard gets any credit for that. That's when all those heavy metal albums were released, along with the cartoon movie of the same name. Now, what was the best years for heavy metal? It was the first half of the 1980s, correlating with a dramatic reduction in violent crime. Coincidence? Well, maybe. It could be that there were other reasons why it was, fun to be alive, or a relatively good time to be, and resulting in that. Now, for this next peak, I'm going to cite an article in the Huffington Post. Back in the 1930s and 40s, the number of nuns, that's people claiming no religious affiliation, hovered at around 5%. They had risen to only 8% by 1990, but since then, the number of people who don't consider themselves part of any religion has increased to 20%. Claude Fisher, one of the researchers at UC Berkeley, told reporters this was not happening really for decades, until around 1990, when it suddenly started to take off. Now, if you look at this last steep and dramatic drop in both the males and females, that's 1994, thereabouts. What happened then? The violent crime rate dropped to unprecedented levels, not seen since the 1970s. What happened that we never recovered the violent crime, that everything suddenly got better? If you remember, this is when most people finally installed the internet. So, this deep decline in violent crime correlates with the sudden availability of unrestricted information and an inexhaustible supply of free downloadable porn. Coincidence? Well, you got to admit that it's hard to commit violent crime when you're otherwise occupied. But I still have to argue with religious believers that over whether things are getting better because of the advances of science, or whether everything is going to hell because of our abandonment of faith. And our descent into irreverent godlessness. So let's forget all these charts and statistics and take a look back in time. See if I got this the right direction. Yeah, let's look back at the good old days and see how advertisers reflected our attitudes when men were better than women. And we've always had a double standard, but it was obviously a lot worse back then. Y'all love that one? Is it always illegal? Spousal abuse, oppression, and neglect were statistically a lot worse then too, but so was our medical misunderstanding. These two ads promote the use of Lysol, a poisonous furniture cleaner then employed for feminine hygiene. This practice resulted in hundreds of accidental deaths and several unknown intentional abortions before it was legal. And the funny thing when you read, you probably can't read this, and I can't get over there to see it, but in the one on the right, It says, a man marries a woman because he loves her. So if the love grows cold, she shouldn't question him. She should question herself. Because I guess women marry men for other reasons than love. I don't know what it is. And then over here on the left, the paragraph begins, yes, she is decidedly to blame. Those good old days don't look all that good to me. Never did. Now, for a better start in life, start cola earlier. How soon is too soon? Not soon enough. Do you remember when ignorance was bliss? Do you remember when you drank Coca-Cola to be healthy? Do you remember when we smoked cigarettes to prolong and preserve life? 4 out of 5 doctors who gave that advice are dead now because of it. The good old days were a time when advertisers weren't held accountable for anything they ever said. I'll let you soak that one in for a moment. Accidental discharge is impossible. Most kids don't shoot themselves accidentally. They shoot their sisters or their brothers, quite intentionally pulling that trigger. Now, I think that the skirting of responsibility is what the religious movement is all about, and that's why they embrace this period. They say that atheists deny the existence of God because we don't want to be accountable for our behavior, but they get to say that whatever sinning they continue to do, they'll automatically be forgiven for simply because they believe. So it occurs to me that they're the ones denying accountability. Where we hold ourselves responsible for our own actions, they don't. That's why the primary objection to global climate change isn't whether or not it's happening, but whether they have to admit any responsibility for it. Now, of course, the good old days weren't just sexist and senseless, they were overtly racist also. Nowadays, you can't just broad brush insults against whole demographics anymore. Ain't that a shame? I don't know how it is here in Canada, but back home in Texas, a lot of my neighbors complain about political correctness, as if it is somehow an infringement on their rights not to be openly disrespectful or hateful against other demographics based on race or religion or what have you. And I've always considered prejudice to be among the worst of all human traits. I don't get how religious fundamentalists don't see bigotry as an abomination. Is it because the Bible itself is bigoted? I think that if God had written the Bible, then it should have said as one of the commandments, thou shalt not discriminate on these bases. And I think one of the reasons that the Bible doesn't say that and why there's no admonishment of slavery either is because the Bible was not written by a superior being. It was written by bigots as a means of manipulating the masses, and that's why bigots endorse and enforce it. Religion and bigotry both, to me, seem to come from the same black recess in the human psyche and are so intertwined that I wonder whether it is possible to have one without the other. Now, when my wife and I toured the Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma, we learned that while Oral was still alive, students could be suspended for interracial dating or expelled for interracial marriage. Now, remember that back in the good old days, and even when I was still a little boy, interracial marriage was illegal in the United States. If this were 1966, I could go to jail for up to a year simply for marrying a woman who was conceived in Vietnam. She would go to jail also for being not quite white, but for marrying a white man. Half-breeds weren't considered white. They had to be purebreds, or they'd be ostracized by both sides of the family. Yeah. And the creationists say that we evolutionists are the racists, as if Hitler wasn't a Catholic Christian and a creationist who rejected evolution outright, as if Darwin didn't prefer dark-skinned natives or protest the practice of eugenics already long perpetuated by Christian groups even before his day. That's just one more thing the religious propaganda machine got turned upside down